Let me, just a couple of questions to start off with. There is a perception, as you know, among many, the 2013 GAO report cited this concern as well, that religious freedom is not a high priority for this administration. Now, in a revelation of priorities, as a matter of fact, Robbie George did testify a couple of times before our subcommittee at one point when, I mean, you're a breath of fresh air. We're so glad you sit in this very strategic position, but the problem has been for almost 3 years, nobody sat in that position. And CPC designations were not forthcoming, even though the Act prescribed an annual designation. They simply didn't happen, and they didn't happen. So a lot of countries that should have been put on notice and held to account were not. And I'm wondering, in the system, how, I mean, do you meet with Secretary Kerry? Does he take your phone calls? Is there an integration of religious freedom and religious persecution issues in all aspects? Does DOD do the same thing? Certainly, whether it be AFRICOM or any of our other efforts, I mean, many of our soldiers and service members are as much diplomats as they are warriors, and I'm wondering how integrated that is with your efforts. I know you travel. When you go to a country, you have an impact, but all the rest of the government, it's a whole-of-government approach, it would seem to me. Can you speak to that issue of whether or not it is? Some of the designations that the USCIRF has, and I and others have called for repeatedly is Vietnam, Pakistan. We just met, as I mentioned, with the Prime Minister a few days ago talking about blasphemy laws. I remember when the minister was gunned down in cold blood on his motorcycle some years ago, Shabazz Badi. I was with you. We were in mourning over his loss. Right. Pakistan has serious problems, and Vietnam got an upgrade in order to get into to get WTO and to get MFN, or PNTR as it's now called. I opposed it and said, let the record speak for itself. I went to Vietnam, met with a lot of people. A lot of those that I met with are now in jail now. Again, like Father Lee, who unfortunately had another show trial, as you know so well. I mean, Vietnam ought to be a CPC. What we do in terms of implementing and sanctioning is purely up to the administration, but the designation itself ought to be done without any other consideration of a foreign policy. And maybe if you would speak to the pattern. I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. We have a hearing in this committee on November 4th. John Shattuck, who was the Assistant Secretary back in the Clinton administration for human rights, testified right where you sit against Frank Wolf's bill, against it, on the record. You know, it was baffling to look back. He was against it. I've often thought there are a whole lot of people who still haven't said this is something we need to work on within state that patterns that suggest that. On the trafficking bill, 2 countries at least, 3 at least, Indonesia, Cuba, and China, didn't get Tier 3, egregious violator of trafficking, even though the record is absolutely Malaysia, I should say. Malaysia was because of the TPP, Cuba because of our rapprochement that we've engaged in, and China because we don't want to offend China, which is ludicrous. On the child abduction law that I wrote, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act, Japan mysteriously dropped off, even though there's 50 cases, because of other considerations. And I'm wondering from your perch, and I don't want to get you fired, but do you see that there's a reluctance to really engage these issues? And Vietnam jumps off the page. They need our help. You know, China threatens them as never before, and it seems that there's an effort to try to build bridges there. Well, calling them out on their persecution seems to me to be a very important thing to do. So if you could, this pattern troubles me when it comes to these fundamental human rights issues and the clear points of, and again, even on China, as you know, China is in a race to the bottom with North Korea when it comes to human rights. We just issued, I chair the China Commission, we just put out our annual report on October 8th. It's chilling, horrifying reading on every human rights point, including religious persecution, and they seem to be getting, even the Patriotic Church and the Three Self movement are being attacked now, and they were supposed to be protected by the government. So if you could speak to some of those issues, I'd appreciate it.
All right, let me take a run at some of these as quickly as I can. First, the integration issue. It used to be a fight to talk with the government over the last 15 years about how connected religious freedom was with so many other concerns we've had. I was really heartened when I arrived to find it is no longer a fight here. It is absolutely clear to everyone you cannot deal with combating violent extremism, with countering terrorism here, if you can have sectarian violence in a country, if you have large numbers of people shut out of participation in a country because of what their religious beliefs are. It is absolutely clear you cannot build democracies, you cannot have effective conflict resolution when you have groups of people who have to choose between abiding by the laws of the country and living out their lives in accordance with their religious conscience, where again, they don't feel they can affirm their lives in that country by following the system. And when that happens, they're filled with the kind of frustration and despair that makes them fertile field for extremists. This is widely understood now in the State Department. And the work of my colleague Sean Casey on the Religion and Global Affairs effort that virtually doubles the number of people at the State Department working on the broader religious issues here. I have a staff of, depending on how you count them, 20, 25 people with part-time people who help write the report, even a little larger than that. Sean has a staff that size. Together, it gives us a formidable ability to really continue to work closely with all the different arms. Almost all of them are really appreciative, not just open, but appreciative of that, recognize you have to deal with these issues. It is a different day today. Is it still clumsy for many people? Yes. These are very hard issues to deal with in an effective manner. I also have to say that I've been struck by, in every country I've been to, and I presume it's been your experience as well in your travels, how robust is the engagement of the embassies on an ongoing basis with the religious communities. When we were pulled together to the religious leaders, they were greeted with open arms. They were greeted with people that they really knew and knew them. I think that's one of the great contributions of what you did with the report. Think about it. Every year, at least 200, 199, 193 embassies have to, or consulates, have to assign staff to draft the report. They have to be in touch with beleaguered religious community or oppressed religious community. When I traveled in 2000 here, that was the most common refrain I had. We now have somebody to talk to. We never had anyone to talk to. We know someone in the embassy that we can talk to. Over the years, thousands of our, well over 1,000 Foreign Service officers have had to immerse themselves in this kind of work. They're all over the place now here. So we find there is robust interaction in the embassies, far beyond what I imagined and I was aware of before I took this position. I find that to be really heartening as well here. Let me move on to your question about access and influence. I was given a choice of several different variants of how this might be arranged. I consulted with some very good people, Congressman Wolf, a little bit with yourself, with Tom Farr, others on this. They promised me before I took this job, I would have as much access as I want. I remember Representative Fortenberry asking the Secretary this question, and he said, I had to work for months to work it out for him to come on board. Do you think I did that where he's not going to have access? There's not been a time that I've reached up to the Secretary's staff, to the Secretary, to the other top staff, where I think within hours I've gotten a response, almost always appreciating, affirming what I asked for and providing what I requested. Here, I really, considering how busy they are, the fact that these responses come at the highest levels so quickly and so encouragingly and supportive to me kind of speaks volumes about that. They really have lived up to that promise. There's not a single time that I've been shut out where I wanted access. I've had the time, both formally and often, kind of step-asides with the Secretary where he says, what's going on here? Bring me up to speed here. What problems you have here, where I've been able to share those with him. So I've been very heartened and encouraged by that. I agree with you about the CPCs. I was clear about that in my testimony. I am pushing very hard to revamp the way that we do this. I do not think we're going to have this problem in the future here, and I think within a short period of time that will become clear. Let me get into some of the individual countries. It's really hard for me on the wonderful work on trafficking, which, as you know, in my prior life, here the coalition that met on this bill met in my offices. Here, you know how strongly I feel about the bill and how closely we worked on it, and same with your child abduction law. It's really not appropriate for me to answer some of these other questions. Obviously, everyone in government should always abide by what the law says in terms of implementing these.
If you could yield for 1 second. The concern is that there's a pattern. With Malaysia, it's the TPP, and there's no way that Malaysia can be a Tier 3 country and go forward with the TPP. Cuba, you know, we're making nice in Cuba, even though you read the trafficking narrative in the TIP report, and it's inescapable. It's a Tier 3 country. It's horrible. And yet they got a country of,
I need to leave it, Mr. Chairman.
So Vietnam,
I need to leave it to you with your great experience in this committee, with its great experience, to make the judgments about patterns. May I just offer one comment about it, however? It is absolutely true. There are problems that emerge over the years. They come in ebbs and flows. They change over the years where things are not as implemented as effectively as we might hope. They remain the exceptions. We deal year after year with scores and scores of countries, some of whom we have deep relations with. We depend on for important interests, where we call it as it was intended to be. We name those countries, and your focus on the times that it's gone off base. I understand that. I would just offer that in the main, all of these things are working, and they are evoking change here in this. I mean, I remember in the very first year of the trafficking report when Israel was named as a tier, many people said, close ally, shouldn't do, and then within a year, they had passed a series of laws, immediately took them out of it.
Same with South Korea.
And we could, you know, you and I could name a score of times that you know, off the top of our heads where this really has worked. So I leave it to you to draw the question about the problematic patterns, but I think we ought to really celebrate also the patterns that show enormous impact that these pieces of legislation you have helped draft have had to beleaguer people all across the globe. Let me just say a word about particularly Vietnam here. You know, I found over the years that there are often not things that are right or wrong, but different truths that are in tension with each other. So your picture of Vietnam, I cannot argue with. You know, from our report, I agree with everything that that you were saying. There are other parts of the picture, however, that I saw when I was there, and we heard from different religious leaders. And as you know, I met with Father Lee in prison. He asked me to send his warmest regards to you and to express how much he appreciates the staunch support that you have given him. We visited other religious prisoners as well. If you visit Vietnam today and compare it to when I was there last a number of years ago, or to people who really know the country well and your own visits 15 years ago, wherever I traveled, the churches are bursting at the seams. In small rural areas of the country, in the cities, here the churches are filled. Here, there is a vibrancy and power, often filled with young families, that is truly inspiring against all of these restrictions. In the face of all of these restrictions, they at least allow for this kind of life to happen. And we have found that these restrictions that you've talked about are imposed very unevenly around the country. There are many areas where the hand of government is much lighter here. And in those areas, the religious communities are organizing, they contribute to the society, able to provide social services. Here, there are extraordinary things that are going on here. But you go to another city, and they crack down all the time and throw in jail the unregistered churches. Here, we're in another city. They kind of turn the blind eye so long as it's not fragrant. That wouldn't have happened 15 years ago. There was no room, no space for any of that. Here, so we are focused right now on using TPP, where there's been an openness for improvements on human rights in several areas, on labor law, on disability rights, and other things that we've been engaged with Vietnam on, where TPP has been a lever to get them to sign international accords and treaties they've never signed before, to reform some of the rule of law issues that we've been pushing on for years. We're pushing very hard on religious freedom. I hope everyone knows that Vietnam is now undertaking a complete revision of their religious law, or their religion law. On the one hand, there are parts of it that are positive. It would add provisions allowing for religious training facilities, the explicit right for religious institutions to raise money for the first time. It would permit clergy to organize religious ceremonies more extensively than it does. It gives prisoners religious rights that it never gave before. On the other hand, in the main, it didn't make the reforms that you have been calling for and we have been calling for. The same regulatory system that controls every aspect of life. Who can go to seminary, what they can teach, who can be appointed as a leader of a church. If you don't have the right to appoint your own clergy, how can you really have religious freedom? The requirement to report everything you're planning to do for a year with every deviance from it having to be approved by the government. We have offered a number of suggestions of how to push that. We've done that in consultation with the religious leadership of Vietnam. We really hope that they will make improvements that will change it from permission to notification. If they want to keep some awareness and control, at least let the religious communities notify them what to do and move ahead. They ought to have a restriction that says, if they are asked for approval for something, if it doesn't come by the time the law says, that becomes a stamp of approval. Otherwise, people wait for years and years for permission to do things. And to ease the restrictions on the unregistered churches, so long as they don't violate some other kind of law here. So we're pushing very hard. One of the big problems is some of the restrictions are written so vaguely, it allows the government to crack down on whatever it wants to do. You can't have a legal system that does that. It can't have overbroad, vague rules controlling religious life this way. So we're working to support the religious community and the NGO community that are pushing hard for these reforms. Let's see what happens on this here. It is an issue of a country of key priority for us here, and we will continue to keep our focus on it.
Thank you. Before yielding, Mr. Cicilline, I would just note, immediately prior to the bilateral trade agreement, Vietnam was taken off the list by the previous administration, so there's no partisan effort here. And very quickly, the day after they won that treaty, or won that benefit, there was a snapback. And the people who had signed the Block 8406, the Human Rights Manifesto, many of the religious freedom people that I met with on my last trip there, which was right before the bilateral trade agreement, were all thrown into jail again. And so it's the lack of durability, and CPC, I would respectfully say, doesn't mean you have to prescribe penalties. You have the option.
Yes.
But the designation is just to be a snapshot. What are they doing? And it seems to me that they have not made the grade, but we'll agree to disagree. Ms. Cicilline.